I'd like to start this short video just by thanking the Royal Historical Society and the panel of judges for considering my book for the wonderful Gladstone Prize. When I see the other books nominated for the prize, it really feels like an honour and a privilege. So thank you very much. My name's David Veevers. I'm author of this little book, The Origins of the British Empire in Asia, 1600 to 1750. And it was published last year by Cambridge University Press in June 2020. And it really is for anyone who's interested in the expansion of the British Empire in this period, the way in which Asian states and empires formed and collapsed, and the relationship between Europeans and Asians, as well as, of course, the history of the English East India Company. Now, the heart of the book is a new interpretation of the early modern British Empire, one that adopts a predominantly Asian-centric perspective. And it does this by emphasising the role, or the Asian genesis of British expansion, and the role played by Asian states and their actors in the narrative of the development and eventual expansion of the English East India Company. And it shows how, after a period of rather spectacular failure, the company only began to succeed in Asia once it learned to work within existing structures of economic and political power, not in building its own. And it does this by subordinating itself to sovereign power of Asian rulers, the accommodation of the interests of Asian elites, and by operating within regulatory frameworks of different local Asian contexts. Only by integrating itself into existing state and imperial systems was the company able to thrive under the carapace of Asian power, not against or outside it. So the book challenges previous histories of Britain's presence in Asia, which I found tended to take far too much of a theological view and to project back onto this earlier period, the sort of spectacular colonial conquests of the later 18th and 19th centuries. But doing that sort of tended to flatten the agency and power of Asian states and their actors, which often formed sort of a hazy, passive backdrop to what is usually depicted as a sort of narrative of stunning English success. But in the 17th and for much of the 18th century, actually, the English presence in Asia was anything but successful or powerful. Quite the opposite, in fact. For the first half of the 17th century, the company was a failing arm of the English state, forced to find new markets for English goods like woolens, which nobody in tropical Asian climates wanted, to upholding English diplomacy with Asian rulers, which the company was spectacularly ill-suited for, all the way to attacking English enemies overseas like the Portuguese and Dutch, which often ended in conflict and defeat. In pursuit then of these narrow national or mercantilist interests, the company struggled to establish itself successfully in Asia. And when combined with an economic crisis which hit Europe in the 1620s, which led to a decline in investment for the company and a drop-off in its trade, and a constitutional crisis in the British Isles from the 1640s, which leads to the company's charter lapsing and it being stripped of its monopoly, it was apparent by mid-century that neither the English state nor its corporate arm, the East India Company, were capable of sustaining a viable presence overseas. And in 1657 even, the company drew up a bill of sale that values the company in its entirety at £14,000 to be sold on the Royal Exchange. Not much to show for over half a century of expansion in Asia. So as the company unravels in Europe, in Asia, meanwhile, its European servants are kind of left to shift for themselves and in a vacuum of corporate and political authority. So gradually, from the mid-17th century, they turned to their local Asian context to feather their own nests. Individual company servants access local sources of political and economic power by marrying into elite Asian and Eurasian families, forming mixed-race families, establishing expansive cross-cultural kinship networks, forging business ties to prominent Asian elites, and even entering the service of Asian rulers. And these gave European servants access to new sources of credit, of cultural patronage, diplomatic influence, and even social authority, which transformed the company's flailing position by the later 17th century. Now, this was also largely facilitated by the process of state and empire formation in Asia itself. Polities like the Mughal Empire or the Sultanate of Golconda in India integrated foreign actors into their political and commercial networks, enfranchising them with a breadth of powers which could then be used to uphold or expand state power. The Mughal Empire, for instance, incorporated Rajput princes, African city naval powers, and even Afghan migrants into their official imperial hierarchies. And they then preserved or empowered them with certain concessions and rights which were used to uphold Mughal authority in that particular part of the vast Indian subcontinent. So Asian elites were only too happy to incorporate and integrate the East India Company into its networks of patronage and business. And they not only helped to increase the state's revenue and to develop local economies and military infrastructure and power, but it also reinforced the authority of those individual elites and their own private profits. So at a time when the company is decentralizing as its servants seek out new sources of power, economic and political, Asian rulers and their elites were responsive to these efforts, and they saw them as an opportunity to expand state or imperial power. So in essence, Asian rulers and their elites vassalized the East India Company, and in exchange the company enjoyed an unprecedented set of commercial and jurisdictional rights, which it would have been completely unable to extract from those states by force, and which placed it well ahead of its European competitors by the 18th century. So we can see how the origins of the British Empire are not necessarily found in the successful projection of Europe over the non-European world, but rather as the result of a weakened English presence being incorporated into far more powerful Asian states and empires by a range of elites bound together through cross-cultural networks. Thank you.